topic is micromobility and active transport, and looking forward to a good discussion on why they are both so critical to both healthy people, but also a healthy zero emissions future. So George Takacs is an active transport advocate who sold his last car 39 years ago, and during his carefree period, car-free and probably carefree as well, he's been a steel worker, student, university academic, Wollongong City Councillor, husband and parent. He is currently an honorary senior fellow with the University of Wollongong, having recently retired after 34 years. He's a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and serves both the Healthy Cities Illawarra board and one other local not-for-profit. And we have Phil Latz. Sorry, Phil, I'll just let these people in. Okay. So Phil, we're delighted to have Phil with us today. He's spent a lifetime being involved in a wide range of cycling and active travel initiatives. After a racing career that included riding in Europe and America, he founded Bicycling Australia magazine in 1989, and various other titles and activities over the next 25 years until it became Australia's largest cycling media and events company. After selling this business, Phil worked in cycling advocacy for 2 years, helping to found We Ride Australia as the national peak cycling advocacy organisation. He also founded World Bicycle Relief Australia and 2 major annual charity rides. In 2019, Phil founded a new media events company that includes the Micromobility Report, which we'll hear about today, and there's a conference organised for that later on in the year. He also interviews a wide range of thought leaders, both within Australia and overseas, on his monthly YouTube program called Influencers. So with that, I will hand over to our speakers. I'll take myself off camera and we'll hand it over to George.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly. I'd like to acknowledge the Dharawal people too as traditional custodians of this land, and also I'd like to acknowledge them as being experts in active transport for whom it wasn't a catchphrase, but their lived experience and just part of normal life. So before I get into my presentation today, I thought I would just start with a little video which for me encapsulates much of what I think active transport is about. It's this little video which came across my Twitter feed last night. I'll just check with Kelly. You can see that now, all right, Kelly?
Yes, that's fine, George.
Okay, I'm just going to play about the first minute and a half of this video, and then I'll get into my talk, but this might help set the mood for what we're going to be discussing during the next hour. Okay, so I'll just stop that there now and get onto my presentation. So that little video, I suppose, shows you what life can be like if you're in a community that has designed itself not around car-dominated transport, but around active transport. So active transport is really about cycling, walking, and other forms of micromobility that Phil will be talking about. And I'll be mostly concentrating on cycling today because I think in the local context, cycling offers the greatest scope for replacing motor vehicle journeys. So I'll be talking a little bit about why active transport is important when it comes to addressing the climate emergency. It's also, I think, the most effective congestion busting measure we have available to us, and we've failed to take advantage of that so far. It also helps a lot with the cost of living, particularly with people now concerned about the increasing price of fuel and the government taking steps to reduce some of that impact by halving the fuel excise for a short period. But it's also, and I suppose this is why it's important to healthy cities, or it's a very important health measure. And I think it would be difficult to overstate the advantages for the health of people in our community of shifting from a car-dominated city to an active transport-dominated city. So if the rest of the details just wash over you in this talk, I think there's only one real thing you need to remember, and that is when it comes to responding to the climate emergency, active transport is an essential tool. When it comes to reducing traffic congestion, active transport is an essential tool. And when it comes to improving quality of life, it is also an essential tool. And I'll get onto a little bit more of that later on. But just to go briefly over what we're going to cover in this talk, we are in a climate emergency, and that's what motivated me to give a presentation similar to this last year. The fact of that climate emergency implies that we need to be reducing emissions rapidly. And when you look at our emissions in Australia, the sector that has grown the most pre-COVID over the last 30 years has been transport. Transport emissions have grown, in relative terms, that is, by 60%. Active transport, unlike, say, shifting to EVs, offers a low-cost way of reducing those emissions. It allows those emissions reductions to happen rapidly, and there are significant co-benefits. So when you put all that together, I think there's a compelling case for us to really looking more seriously at active transport than we have been. When it comes to congestion, there's nothing else you can do which is going to reduce congestion as much in our cities as active transport. If you look at the results of the household travel survey, you'll find that most car trips in Wollongong are actually relatively short. The averages are around 10 kilometres, but the averages don't tell you what's most typical because many journeys are much, much longer than that. So something like 50% of all car journeys are around 5 kilometres or less, and they're the ones we should be looking to replace with cycling. And if we do this, we can actually achieve quite a significant increase in quality of life. And it can happen very rapidly. It can happen in less than a decade. We can completely transform how people get around this city and allow them to have a much better life than they're having at present. And the good news is it's not rocket science. It's being done elsewhere. We know what to do and we know what some of the barriers are. And so we just need to have all that information available to us so we can get moving and get there. So to start off with the climate emergency, to really put it into context, when you look at the emissions budget for achieving a 50% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's only 500 gigatons of CO2. It sounds like a lot, 500 billion tonnes, but that is only 12 and a half years at our current rate of emissions, right? So if we kept emitting at the current rate globally for 12 and a half years, that's it, our carbon budget for a 50% chance is gone. When you look at that budget and say, well, what happens if we decide that every person on the planet has an equal right to future emissions within that budget? What does it amount to? Well, it amounts to 67 tonnes per person. Again, that might not mean much to you, but when you look in Australia, where our current emissions per capita are around 22 tonnes, that's for the average Australian 3 years at current emissions levels. So that indicates to you the rapidity with which we really need to start reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, when it comes to active transport, if you look at things like walking's okay for very short trips. You know, for most people, you would have difficulty getting them to walk on a regular basis more than a kilometre or two. But when you look at cycling, cycling expands what people can do in the same time compared to walking by about a factor of 5. And that brings it into the range of typical car journeys within our city. Not all car journeys, but most of them, right? That 5 to 10 kilometre range. The advantage that cycling has over, say, electrifying all our transport is it has very low resource requirements. There's a low upfront cost for the user. A high proportion of our population don't have a driver's licence, about 30%. Some of those don't have a driver's licence because they're not yet of age. But there are many people, and you go overseas, you can see children having transport independence via bicycles from the age of about 4 or 5 upwards in countries that have good cycling infrastructure. So all of those people can get transport independence here. And then you also get people with other mobility issues who have difficulty walking, and they can even have difficulty accessing public transport, but they can actually ride a bike. So it services all those people. Another advantage for people who want to roll out this change is the low infrastructure costs. It doesn't take a lot of money compared to trying to deliver transport services via other means. And I'll talk about Seville now. When you look at Seville, when they made their big changes back in around starting 2007, as well as looking at active transport, they built a new light rail system. But when you look at the trips that were provided in that light rail system per day and the cost, and then you look at the increase in trips from cycling and the cost, the cycling was about 16 times more cost effective per trip than the light rail. And the light rail was cheaper than a lot of the other options as well. So cycling wins hands down when it comes to cost. And with Seville also highlighted the rapidity with which you can make change. So in 2007, with the new council, they came into power with an agenda to significantly improve active transport. And in their first term from 2007 to 2011, that local council increased trips by bicycle per day into their CBD from 7,000 per day to 70,000. That's a 10-fold increase in just 4 years. Now you can compare that with Wollongong City Council's cycling strategy, where over a decade, they're aiming to increase cycling from 0.7% of all trips to 2%, a factor of 3 in 10 years, as opposed to a factor of 10 in 4 years. So there's scope there for significantly more ambition. When it comes to energy usage, cycling, of all forms of land transport, is the most energy efficient. And just as an example here to highlight that, I've got some figures from a bicycle ride I did last year now, but it was a 56 kilometre ride, and my smartwatch told me that I burned about 4,217 kilojoules on that ride, which works out at 75 kilojoules per kilometre. If you compare that to the energy that would be used by an internal combustion engine vehicle travelling that same trip, it would use about 5 litres of fuel at the average fuel efficiency of the Australian car fleet, and that means it's going to end up burning about 3,125 kilojoules per kilometre. That's 40 times more energy per kilometre to do the same thing. Right? If you look at a battery electric vehicle, that's less. Uses about 10 times as much energy as a person on a bike, and about a quarter as much as a person in an internal combustion engine vehicle. And this is one of the reasons, not the only one, it's one of the reasons why Rob Stokes, who's now the Active Transport Minister in New South Wales, said some months ago, the problem with an electric vehicle is at the end of the day, or the electric car, at the end of the day, it is still a car. And it comes with all the other inefficiencies associated with motor vehicles. And one of those important ones is, of course, land usage. And I know from something on Phil's Micromobility Report website that Rob Stokes made this point about land usage again at a summit that was held, a mobility summit that was held in Sydney recently. When you look at land usage and the number of people you can move per hour in, say, a typical 3.5 metre wide vehicle lane, the only thing that beats bicycles is buses, right? But buses don't offer some of the other advantages when it comes to active transport, some of the health advantages and so on. So of the options other than buses, bicycles are the next most efficient way of moving people given a limited amount of land. So you can typically move around 7 times as many people per hour in a lane that's been repurposed for bicycles than you can if you had people travelling that in their cars. And to give the example of Amsterdam is one of the cycling capitals of the world. And if you go the city of Amsterdam is broken up into about 5 regions, but if you look at the city centre region, in that central region, about 62% of all trips are conducted by bicycles, but bicycles only have 15% of the road space. Cars account for 16% of trips. It's only about a quarter as many trips, but they have 70% of the road space. So a quarter of the trips for 4 times the road space. That shows you how inefficient cars are. When you look at the resources that go into the vehicles, a typical bicycle is 10 kilos, might be 20 kilos for an electric bike. A typical car these days is around 2,000 kilos. So there's a lot more resources that need to go into a car, and that applies to an electric car as well. If you look at an e-bike battery, for instance, a typical e-bike battery, the size of that is about 1/100th the size of a typical battery electric vehicle car battery. And then if you look at the overall resources required, and you think about what if we wanted to give everybody electric mobility, well, you could give everybody on the planet an e-bike for the same amount of resources as it would take to give 1% of the people on the planet an electric car. Right? So the scope of the resource usage is, they're not even comparable. So bicycles are more energy efficient, and they're more land efficient, and they're more resource efficient. But they also help to address the healthcare crisis. And I'll use this little picture here with a lady who's obviously quite heavily pregnant, because it reminded me of the, I think it was in New Zealand recently, a cabinet minister there rode her bicycle to hospital to give birth. For the second time, I think, that she's done that. But with healthcare is something that's, the healthcare crisis is not new in Australia. It's something which has come to the fore during COVID, but the underlying problems in our healthcare system were there pre-COVID. And a lot of them relate to health problems which are preventable through more physical activity. So when you come to active transport, and if you replace a lot of your car trips, you get rid of a lot of your air pollution, and air pollution is linked to things like heart disease and dementia. The greater physical activity levels also reduce heart disease. And they reduce type 2 diabetes, which is a growing problem. They improve immunity, which when you're in the middle of a pandemic is also important. Shifting to active transport reduces noise pollution. It gives more people transport independence than you have with cars. And it's also important when it comes to equity, because it's accessible to a broader demographic. When you have children who have transport mobility from an early age, that leads to greater resilience in those children as they grow up and become adults, and it also improves mental health. And then the final thing about active transport, what it does for health and social well-being are interconnected, but there's many social benefits that come from active transport, because when you go somewhere on a bicycle in a city, the bicycle is connecting you not just to your destination. The trip you undertake connects you to people in your community and your environment, and that's really important these days, and it's important for mental health. So when you take all that on board, it becomes quite apparent that, or should be, that shifting to active transport dominated cities as opposed to car dominated cities can bring about a significant increase in quality of life, and it's much greater than just about anything else you can do. Another study that was done on the health benefits of active commuting found that active commuting, when you corrected for all the selection factors, leads to about a 21% reduction in all-cause mortality. So that's when you take into account that if you ride a bike or walk, you might have a traffic accident. But when you look at all the other benefits, it's about a 21% reduction in all-cause mortality. And that is just off the scale when it comes to any sort of medical intervention. So how do we get there? Well, there's, in an abstract way, you have to start off by motivating people to people feeling like they want to get there in the first place. But the second thing is, once you can have motivated people to get there, you've got to have a vision. And once you have that vision, you need to look at what you've got now and compare it to your vision and remove things that are not part of that vision. And then when it comes to doing things that you're going to do, you also need to make sure that you don't invest in failure. You know, any person with any brains learns from their mistakes, but a smarter person will also learn from mistakes that have been made by others. That is, they'll make sure their own mistakes are entirely original before they learn from them. So when you look at some of the things that we do in Australia with active transport, we're failing to learn lessons from other places. And I suppose locally, the Smith Street cycleway, where we've put a bi-directional cycleway on one side of the road where there's frequent interactions with vehicles, that's just against world's best practice. You'd put a unidirectional cycle lane on each side of the road, normally under those circumstances around the rest of the world. And the other part of getting there, of course, is to talk to politicians. And I just put this little cartoon up here because it's from, it's relevant because it's from Cycling UK, who were lobbying people during the recent council elections in the UK, where the implementation of what were called local or low traffic neighbourhoods had become a controversial issue during the pandemic. And it turned out in these elections that the people who were advocating, the candidates who were advocating for maintaining these low traffic neighbourhoods and expanding them, actually either retained their seats in local government or gained a seat in local government, whereas those who were advocating against it and advocating against active transport actually lost seats. So it's proven to be a political winner in the local government elections in the UK. And this little cartoon here captures all the reasons I've outlined for why it's a good thing to do, and quite a few more of them as well. So I thought I'd leave you with that, and we can get on to questions maybe after Phil's talk. So Kelly, I'll stop sharing there and hand back to you.
Thanks, George. I think we can go straight to Phil.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. I'll just share the screen. Just hang on one tick. Okay, are you able to see that okay, Kelly?
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. George has mentioned a couple of things that I'll make sure I don't overlap with or perhaps reinforce, but I'm going to give you an overview of micromobility as an industry, if you like, or what is actually happening. I'll just go at a very high level, keep it short, happy to answer any questions at the end. So as George mentioned, it's actually been around for millions of years. The most simple form of micromobility of all is walking. But then about 200 years ago, we invented the bicycle. And then 20 years ago, and only really coming into popularity in the last few years, has been a plethora of new machines, new form factors, if you like. Obviously, the electric scooter, which Rob Stokes, the Active Transport Minister, just announced that a trial is starting in New South Wales from July. They're already legal in 4 states and territories across Australia, so they're coming very quickly in Australia. E-cargo bikes, deliveries, logistics is rapidly growing as well. Food delivery, you see guys like this every night in Wollongong delivering your pizza or whatever you might be buying. Once again, an electric bike. That particular company is an Australian company which has had huge venture capital funding from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and other companies around the world. E-skateboards. And the next one, mono wheels, unicycles, all sorts of different form factors. Now, when you look at that, I suspect that some of you might be asking, oh, of course, live electric vehicles like this that can move cargo and people. So you might be asking, hang on a minute, I don't think that's legal. What if it's not legal? And I would say, well, technology leads law. The law inevitably catches up with technology. For example, in the early days of the motor car, were you aware that there was actually a thing called the Locomotive Act? This is both in the UK and the USA, where originally you had to have somebody walking with a red flag in front of your car. Now, clearly, that's quite comical. This is a modern reproduction or a recreation of that scene. I don't think they had colour photography back then. But, you know, it's sort of a bit familiar in a way. That Locomotive Act was brought about by the Teamsters, like the horse and cart people who were the power brokers at the time. And they fought hard to resist the new kid on the block, which was the car. And history repeats, because now, of course, when you say, oh, we want to remove parking or remove a traffic lane to put in a protected cycle lane, shared path, whatever, who's complaining now? So it goes full circle. So light electric vehicles, I showed you the photos, different examples. As George said, they're actually much cheaper, and therefore, not surprising, if you look at this, all the talk in the media is about electric vehicles, but as of 2020, only 3 million electric cars were sold in that year across the entire world. Whereas you look at this chart of 8 selected countries, not necessarily the 8 biggest countries by any means. Australia is probably number 50 or something like that in the world scale. You can see that just from these 8 countries over the 2020-21 year, there was over 20 million e-bikes sold. So 7 times more e-bikes sold than cars, e-cars, in a selection of 8 countries. So right from the start, electric bikes have been vastly outselling electric cars, even though all the subsidies, all the talk is all about electric cars. So why is this market growing so fast? So I'll look at 2 sets of factors, supply side and demand side factors. Electrification. I don't know how many of you have actually ridden an e-bike, but if you haven't, please do yourself a favor, as Molly Meldrum used to say, and hop on an e-bike and have a ride, and you'll get the e-bike smile, and you'll understand why these things are so popular. People are riding further and more frequently than if they have a non-e-bike. As George mentioned, the battery is 100 times smaller. We know about shortages of lithium and other materials for batteries. Well, the problem is 100 times less acute for e-bikes than it is for electric cars. Although Australia, Wollongong, New South Wales is not doing a good job with funding, globally, the trend is massive uptick in funding. All sorts of countries and cities around the world, and also private equity. If you look at bike share, scooter share, investments in manufacturing and so on. I've been in the bicycle trade as a journalist for 33 years now. There's been nothing at all like the last few years. The industry is absolutely booming. Smartphones and apps, connectivity, the Internet of Things. It's turbocharging light electric vehicles. I don't know how many of you know about these terms. You know, GPS, you probably all know. Geofencing, speed limiting, accelerometers. So for example, with a scooter share trial, you can geofence the scooters so that they can't go in a particular shopping mall or particular busy area. They'll depower automatically if you try and ride there. Likewise, speed limiting. If you ride the e-scooter share scheme in Canberra and you go in the central triangle of Lake Burley-Griffin, the moment you ride under the Commonwealth Avenue Bridge, it slows down from 25 kilometres an hour to 15 kilometres an hour. It's automatically speed limited, once again linked to the GPS. Accelerometers, so that if the scooter is tipped over, and there was a lot of talk about bicycle scooters lying around on the footpath, well, the new ones are coming with accelerometers equipped. So at the headquarters of the scooter share company, they immediately know, oh, somebody's tipped over that scooter. And councils are having level of service requirements in their contracts that say that that scooter must be put back upright within 2 hours, or that's a black mark against the share company. So there's a lot of technology coming which really improves these fleets. And new form factors. So there's new types of vehicles that didn't exist a few years ago, which are coming at a rate of knots. And the concept of mobility as a service, so longer term leasing, short term hiring. There's all sorts of new solutions and new service providers entering the market, new capital. So on the demand side, we've got combating climate change, as George mentioned so well in his presentation, so I won't go into any more detail about that. Increased urbanisation, both in Australia and globally. The inexorable trend over the recent decades has been a higher percentage of people living in cities. increased density within those cities. As the land cost goes up, we see that in Sydney, we see that in Wollongong. More apartments, higher density. Higher density lends itself to micromobility because of that short trip requirement. Our aging population. People are locked out of the car ecosystem. If you can't, maintain your driver's license, you become, housebound and trapped. Whereas micromobility can give solutions to people so that they're not locked out of transport and all the opportunities that that brings. George mentioned this, obesity, inactivity. It's not an original word, but you might have heard the term diacardiobesity, diabetes, cardiac disease, and obesity, the diseases of affluence. These are the most expensive diseases to treat in our health system. They're chronic diseases. They don't kill you straight away. A lot of long-term treatment, and health is growing in its expense, but within that, diacardiobesity is growing much more quickly than the overall health expense. So these are the diseases of affluence, the diseases of inactivity. Air pollution, George touched on, and noise pollution. And these things lead to lack of concentration, mental health issues, and as well as physical health issues. So what does the future hold? Well, with all those tailwinds, both on the supply side and demand side, to me, it's inevitable that we are going to see a massive growth in micromobility worldwide, faster than you think and bigger than you think. That is my prediction. Come and talk to me in 2 or 3 years' time and tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm putting my money where my mouth is. So thank you very much for that. I'll pass back to Kelly, but if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. And if you'd like to see more and try some of these bikes in the flesh, as Kelly said, we will be running a conference and expo later in the year. Thank you very much, Kelly.
Thanks, Phil. Where will that conference be?
It will be at Randwick Racecourse in Sydney at the end of November.
November. Okay, we'll add that to the list. If anyone has any questions, and I'd be really interested to know if there's anyone from Transport Services or Transport for New South Wales or local government in the room that might have any opinions on pop-up cycleways or any of the initiatives that have been kind of mooted in those presentations. I think it was really interesting around the pushback with the, the locomotive thing. That was really interesting. History does repeat itself. No questions in the chat at the moment. I think they're maybe just too comprehensive, too understandable. Hey, Belinda, do you have a question?
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, George. Thanks, Phil. That was really interesting. I always love listening to George speak, but thanks, Phil. That was, yeah, a very new topic for me to hear about more micromobility. I was recently in Tasmania, and it's, yeah, and the scooters there are amazing and do exactly what you say in terms of speed, and it was excellent in terms of getting around and not having to wait for buses, and yeah, they were just really easy for us to get around, especially Hobart. I was just wondering if you'd seen a take up like at universities. I was just thinking of our students and the issues we have. Sorry, I'm at the University of Wollongong, and the issues we have with parking, and it's always, you know, a key conversation topic, especially as we're coming more back on campus. I was wondering if you'd seen a take up of this micromobility across universities. Anyone in particular as an example?
You want to comment first, George?
Well, yeah, like you, Belinda, I'm at the university at present too, and I've been coming to this campus on a daily basis for, well, too long now, decades, well, not too long actually. But look, I haven't really noticed much of a change around the university. I've noticed a change around the city more broadly, a really significant change. I see a lot of people on e-scooters and e-skateboards. I see the cycling demographic has expanded in Wollongong quite substantially. Maybe it's part of the ageing population, but there's a lot more older people out there on bikes. I feel like over the last 20 odd years that I've been cycling in Wollongong, the age of the typical cyclist has always been about 10 years older than I am, and it's been true for 25 years. But no, there's a lot of older people out on bikes, particularly e-bikes. I would say that 80% of the people I see riding bikes who are older than me are on e-bikes. And I know several people personally for whom e-bikes have been a big changer. Now, that's probably not something that's going to be attractive to a lot of our students, but I was actually thinking the university could trial something at some of the student accommodations where it reduced the amount of parking that was there at the student accommodation and said, if you want to live here and not park, we'll give you an e-bike for the year that you're here or the semester, and see how that works. Because I noticed, as somebody who lives quite close to the university, I noticed how much of the parking on streets near the university is taken up by students, even outside of normal semester, like the Coolabong students all parked on the road at the western edge of the university. They're there, quite a lot of the year. And so all these students come here from, a lot of them outside the area, and they all come with a car thinking that they need a car to get around. Now, the interesting thing about Wollongong is, I did this on Google the other night, is if you ask it to show you how long it takes to get from one point to another, and say by bike, from about Mount Kira Road North, it's really difficult to live more than a 10-minute bike ride from your nearest train station, for instance. So, bicycles coupled to a better train service, a more frequent train service within the city, I think could really change the way we get around our city. But yeah, look, I haven't noticed too many changes at the university, but significant changes outside the university, I would say.
So just move on soon to Rowan, and then Lena's got a question. But Belinda, Healthy Cities put in a legacy grant application recently and got through to the pitch stage, whereby I think had so much support from the university, council, a whole range of stakeholders, that even if we're not successful in the legacy grant, we will come together and really put our heads together for an active transport strategy for the uni. And it's really looking at that 10-kilometre university radius, and there was also sort of collaboration and interest with the two high schools and TAFE, so Wollongong, Kira, TAFE, so watch that space. Hopefully we will get some funding to make that happen. But Rowan, would you like to put yourself on camera or just ask a question?
Oops, so it's saying I can't turn on the camera because my host has stopped me.
Yeah, that's maybe me. Here we go. There we go. Sorry about that.
There we go. Yeah, my question is about what Seville did to achieve this tenfold increase, what particular measures they took, and how portable would those measures be to Wollongong?
Yeah, okay, so I suppose I'll answer that. Maybe Phil's got some additional insights, but look, I've watched some video interviews with some of the local government officials who were involved in that, and then some of the bureaucrats. And really there was one key measure which I think translates to just about everywhere, and that is they repurposed space, right? They didn't go and build additional infrastructure. They just said, well, we've got this existing road space, let's just repurpose it. And they got rid of car parking in the CBD, right, in a strategic way, but they did it in a strategic, coherent way. So they weren't building little itty bits of a network. They just said, we need to build the whole network, right? So they took a whole network approach and they said, this is going to be unpopular at first, but we've got a 4-year term. They came to power with a plan already of what they needed to do. They rolled out most of the changes within the first 2 years of that term. And then the next 2 years, of course, people lived with it, experienced it, and thought, well, this is better than what we had before, even though we didn't like it at the start, and they got re-elected resoundingly. So it was really about repurposing space, and that saved them having to build a whole lot of new infrastructure, widen roads to create cycle lanes or whatever. They just used the space that was there differently.
Thanks, George. Lena?
Yes, so I'm a walking advocate, so for Walk Sydney, and my question is a bit about e-scooters, because there is obviously this e-scooters can create a problem with people walking if they're on the footpath. So I was interested what you think, how to make sure that e-scooters actually replace car journeys, which is obviously great for walking, because you don't want to, it's obviously a lot nicer to be hit by an e-scooter than by a car, if you have to choose. And also, obviously, hopefully you don't get hit at all, and it creates less noise, all these benefits. So it's great for walking, but obviously if it is not taking away space from walking, I guess it would be my take on that. Or if you see that differently, I would be interested to hear that. And also, do you think it's a form of active transport, or would you say it's not active? So just because it's a controversial topic, and it's really interesting to hear a little bit of the different sides of that.
Great question. Phil?
Okay, well, I'll take that in two parts. Firstly, will e-scooters take away some trips from walking? Yes, they will. Some trips based on some studies so far, but they will also take away some trips from, driving, and trips from cycling and so on. So I think it's much preferable to have, something that weighs 10 kilograms perhaps going at 25 kilometers an hour or 15 kilometers an hour, than have something 2,000 kilograms going at 50 or 60 kilometers an hour in a dense urban area. There is controversy in Australia, or difference, say in Brisbane. The state government went, Queensland or Brisbane was one of the first to implement e-scooters and an e-scooter share scheme trial, okay? And the state government basically put their hands up and said too hard, and the city of Brisbane took control. Now, the city of Brisbane is the largest municipality in Australia. Most of Brisbane is just a single LGA, local government area. So they are the most populous and have the most power and control, if you like, to do something like that. And so in Brisbane, they're legal on the scooters because the state controls the roads, the council controls the footpaths. And so they said, right, we can ride them on the footpaths. Ultimately, the best spot, I believe, for e-scooters to be riding is in shared paths, as in, dedicated third lanes, if you like. So you have your footpath, you have your, light electric vehicle path, which is your bicycle path, scooter path, 5 or 10 other sorts of form factor path. And then you have your traditional large vehicle, roadway as well. You see that, in Copenhagen, in Amsterdam, you'll have those three sets of carriageways quite distinct. I think that's the best long-term solution. Of course, we don't have that network in Australia, so we have to make do and work around with what we've got. I think with things like speed limiting and so on, the problem can be mitigated and managed. I know it's great fodder. A little old lady gets knocked over when she walks out of the cafe, and there was the video in Hobart you mentioned. I think, was it Belinda mentioned Hobart? There was an incident with a near miss in a cafe, and it was on the closed circuit TV of the cafe. Headline news, Meanwhile, 1,100 people get killed by cars every year, cars and motorbikes every year in Australia, and tens of thousands injured. So we've got to look at the data, look at it in proportion before, chucking the baby out with the bathwater, in my opinion. I think it can be managed.
Thanks, Phil. I've seen, around my local area, quite a number of kids on e-scooters where you've got the one, standing steering, and then another passenger kind of, crouched down in a ball, which just reminded me of, in my day, you had somebody on the handlebars of your cycle going around. So yeah, times are sort of changing there. I think we might.
Sorry, can I just ask one more question? So Phil, are they allowed to be on the footpaths in these trials that we're doing now? Is that or is the law that they should be?
It depends upon which footpath, okay? And some footpaths, especially in Sydney, are designated as shared paths and signed appropriately, and others are not. So it is a bit of a grey area. But certainly in Brisbane, they're allowed on the footpaths. That's their designated spot. But not all footpaths were created equally. A footpath in a busy shopping precinct clearly, is not suitable for people riding and scooting down. A footpath in a quiet suburban street that might get 2 pedestrians an hour, you know, there's no real safety issue with someone riding or scooting along that. And in fact, you know, children under 16 or adults accompanying them are allowed to ride a normal bicycle on a footpath in New South Wales and have been for years. So, and it doesn't cause problems. So I think
So they
it's
would
more
have the
just
same
that-
regulations like bikes, basically. Is it like, is that the same? Like
Yeah, as
yeah.
I understand it, I don't know if they're going to make any special rules for this trial, but as I understand it, that's how it'll be.
Does anyone else have any further questions? Otherwise, we can wrap up and you can have an early minute for your lunch. So again, thank you very, very much to Phil and George for giving up your valuable time in your Friday lunch hour. I know Phil's in between several other meetings up in Sydney today, so thanks for squeezing us in. And thanks everyone else for your attendance. We'll put this on our socials next week, so feel free to share it around to those who you think may get something out of it, and enjoy the weekend. Thanks
Kelly.
everybody.
Thanks very
Thanks,
much.
Phil.
Bye.